Okay, everyone, this week we're going to actually study the Age of Exploration, and I am in particular going to talk a bit about the background to the Age of Exploration and why it was that it was Western Europeans who initially launched this exploration rather than Eastern Europeans or the Chinese or the Islamic world. What actually gave them the advantage to begin discovery of the New World. I also want to talk a little bit about what kind of colonies were set up in each of the places where these European countries landed, how the natives were treated, and what exactly they were looking for when they went out into these unknown parts of the world and began to settle down and interact with distant and, in many cases, very different people than anything they'd seen in the past. If you look at the roots of the Age of Exploration, probably the greatest is that Europeans have developed a taste for the luxury goods throughout their crusading efforts. In particular, they've come into contact with the Muslim world, moved into India as well as China, and they are interested in the spices and the various goods that are available in the East. And the way that they attempt to gain access to this territory is by looking for a sea route to the east and slowly voyaging down the west coast and the tip of southern Africa, up the East African coast, and finally arriving in Calcutta, India in 1498. They are specifically searching for tropical spices like nutmeg and cinnamon, mace, cloves, and above all, pepper. At one point, pepper is actually worth more than the same weight of gold. The other thing they're looking for is Chinese silk, Indian cotton, rhubarb for their medications, emeralds, rubies, and sapphires as well. Now, despite the fact that they really have a taste for these luxury items, there are some things that are hindering European trade with Asia. And the first of these is that the supply of the goods is really in Muslim hands. If you remember, directly after the Crusades, we see the birth of three of the gunpowder empires: the Safavid, the Ottoman, and the Mughal empires, and these are located directly between where those living in Western Europe and those living in China and India are located, and so the Muslims have complete control of those trade routes. At one point, the Pope even threatens to excommunicate any European Christians who have trading contact with Muslim traders. And so what ends up happening is that Venice, Italy, begins to really monopolize the European trade in Eastern goods, and a lot of countries disliked relying upon Venice, although for Venice's part it became an extremely wealthy area. One of the other key issues that Europeans have is their method of actually paying for the Eastern goods that they want. The Eastern markets don't really want what Europe, which is a far less developed area, has to offer. Remember that this is a time period where Europe is just coming out of the Dark Ages, where they had very little invention, there wasn't a great deal of wealth. In Western Europe, they lived this feudal lifestyle, there was high illiteracy rates and poverty, and they had a bartering system. Whereas in China, they had this flowering of art and literature and economy under the Tang and the Song dynasty. And in fact, their urban cities were actually the greatest in the world. And so they require Europe to actually pay them in gold and in silver, and Europeans don't necessarily have gold or silver in large amounts at this point, but it makes them have a desire for these precious metals, which is eventually going to really fuel the Age of Exploration and also fuel their colonization of places where they can force indigenous people to mine for silver or for gold. You might be asking yourself, why in particular is it that Western Europe, rather than some other portion of Europe, actually initiates the Age of Exploration? Because if you remember, in the past, it's the Byzantine Empire that was the wealthiest of the two halves of Europe. It was the one that was most urban, with the city of Constantinople at its heart, and it had the best taxation system and road network and lots of vestiges of the Roman Empire, while Western Europe fell far behind. You saw high rates of disease, you also saw vast illiteracy rates, and a very much rural existence and comparison. And part of the reason for that in the past is because the Byzantine Empire was connected directly to the Silk Roads. And so they had a very open line of communication and trade between themselves and India and China. Whereas due to the geography of Western Europe and the fact that it was isolated, they were not a part of these trade routes. But if you look at the map, during the Age of Exploration, these countries are on the Atlantic rim of Europe. Places like Portugal, Spain, Britain, and France can easily lead the way to an empire in the Western Hemisphere just by crossing the Atlantic Ocean. I would say you also can't underestimate the fact that people in Western Europe were very much aware of their worldly position. And after the end of the Crusades, after 1200, Europeans were very aware that they had a marginal position in the world of Eurasian commerce. They realized that the Islamic states, the three large Islamic states, had taken control of large parts of Africa and Europe and Asia, and they were determined to gain access to that world. They viewed it as an extension of the Crusades and of taking back territory that had once belonged to them. The people of Western Europe also developed superior technological innovations during this time period, as influenced by their contact with the gunpowder empires. The first technological innovation is through their navy, and it was built upon both the Chinese and the Islamic precedent, and having a large navy allowed them to cross the Atlantic easily. Also, they developed ironworking technology, gunpowder, weapons, and horses, and a lot of this they take from both China and the new Islamic states. But when they get over into the New World, it's going to be something that the indigenous inhabitants don't have access to, which is going to make conquest far easier. As I mentioned before, many of the Western European explorers who made it to the New World viewed themselves as continuing on the tradition of the Crusades. They believed that they were persecuted minorities who were looking for more freedom, and that they were attempting to escape a world that was teeming with danger in the post-Crusades era, where the creation of the Ottoman Empire, for example, showed that Muslims had more power in the area than Christians. And in a lot of ways, Christians in many places blended pretty easily with the kind of specialized indigenous gods, and their belief in magic and folk medicine and communion with the dead remained very strong. There was a great deal of superstition that was attached to these early forms of Christianity, which has changed in the modern day. And many of them gravitated towards the world of their conqueror. So when the Spanish, for example, went into the territory that would become New Spain, they began to convert many of the indigenous people, and those people converted because they saw similarities between their own indigenous gods and the world of Christianity, or they saw particular benefits to conversion. But for the explorers, there certainly was a religious motivation as part of their reason for sailing across the Atlantic Ocean. Regardless of whether it was Western Europe that actually began the Age of Exploration and went into these new territories, there is actually one factor seen in North and South America that made it easy for someone to come in and colonize the people and to conquer them. And this factor is the local divisions that existed amongst the indigenous people. If you look at the map here, you see these various names like subarctic, northwest coast, plains, and these are the different cultural groups that existed amongst the Native Americans within just North America. And you'll notice that within each one of these cultural groups, there are hundreds, perhaps, of individual native tribes. And each one of these tribes would have had their own belief system, their own religious beliefs, their own views of the world, and they would have had their own system of allies and enemies. And so when people from the old world came over to the new world, they would certainly have encountered groups of people that were already warring with one another. It would not have been a united front necessarily, and so they could take that age-old battle tactic of divide and conquer and use it in their favor. Yet another aspect that contributed to easy colonization of Native people was the Great Dying, which was the demographic collapse of Native American society as a result of the fact that disease was being brought from the Old World to the New World. If you look at the population of the pre-Columbian Western Hemisphere, there were about 60 to 80 million indigenous people living there. They had absolutely no immunity to these old world diseases that came across the ocean, and their mortality rate shot up to 90% in some areas. And the native population almost vanishes in the Caribbean. Central Mexico, the population drops from 10 million to 20 million to just around 1 million by 1650, and there's a similar mortality rate throughout most of North America. The next thing I want to do is just to talk a little bit about who the major players were in the age of discovery or exploration, and to see exactly what tactics they used when they went exploring and what their motivations were for exploration. The Portuguese have been called by some historians the bullies of the sea, and in many ways they're the ones who launched the age of exploration. They are particularly interested in the Indian Ocean commerce because this is a very diverse and a very rich commerce. However, they don't necessarily have any goods that would make them competitive in this market. So instead, they become pirates. And it's very easy for them to engage in piracy because they have strong naval technology and they're able to very easily maneuver their ships. And these ships are also some of the only ships in Western Europe at the time to carry cannons. They're led by Vasco da Gama, and they can easily outgun and dominate any of the Asian fleets that remain. They decide to actually set up a trading post empire. They're not really worried about settling down and mingling with the people initially. Instead, they set up these fortified bases at key locations that will allow them to continue trading throughout the Indian Ocean network. They block the Red Sea route to the Mediterranean, and for about an entire century they monopolize that route between Africa and Europe. If you look at the characteristics of Portuguese commerce, you see that really their desire is to control commerce, not necessarily to control territory. Eventually, the Portuguese will begin settling down right near the Asian ports, and they'll start interacting with both Asian and African people as well, and becoming members of their society. But originally, this really isn't about territorial acquisition. And the way that they get their work done is through force of arms. It's got nothing to do with economic competition, but forcing people to do what they want. And one of the ways that they make the most money is that they require any merchant vessel in the East that wants to go through the water that they have control of to purchase a cartaz, which is a pass. And basically they have to pay a duty of anywhere between 6 and 10% on the cargo they have on their ship. So while they may not necessarily be involved in trading goods themselves, they're still making a large amount on the goods that other countries are trading in the area. The downfall of the Portuguese really comes in the fact that they never succeed in controlling more than half of the spice trade to Europe. They realized that they couldn't totally dominate the Indian Ocean commerce, and they end up stepping back. By 1600, their trading post empire is really steeply declining because of the fact that this small European country has overextended themselves too much. Think of the analogy of playing a game of Risk. I don't know if you all have played that, but when you play the game, you're essentially given a certain number of troops, and you roll the dice whenever you attack a particular area to see who wins the battle. And if you spread all of your pieces too thin, say you have a battle in Africa, and you have a battle in Asia, and a battle in Europe, then it's much easier to conquer your forces. And what the Portuguese did was to spread, there was this very tiny country, they spread themselves out too far throughout Asia, especially in the area of India as well as in Africa, and it ended up being their downfall, which meant that they weren't the ones to continue the kind of crusading tradition of the age of exploration, but instead the Spanish would actually pick up after them. The first country to really challenge the Portuguese rule over the age of exploration was Spain. And it was during this time that Spain actually established a base in the Philippines. The first time that the Spanish really encountered the Philippines was when Ferdinand Magellan circumnavigated the globe. And he did this between 1519 and 1521. He was the first person to successfully sail around the entirety of the globe. And while on his sailing expedition, he discovered these islands, which were located close to the trade routes of all of Asia, in particular of China, and India was close as well. And so if you looked at the Philippines during this time period, they were a very culturally diverse group of people, and they were composed of small competing chiefdoms. So there weren't any very large and powerful monarchs here. There are really three main reasons why Spain wanted the Philippines, and probably the most obvious of these is the location of the Philippines when compared to the rest of Eurasia. As you can see here, the Philippines are in the orangish red color, located just above where it says Indonesia on the map, and they're located very close to China, which means that they're going to be right on the edge of the former trade networks of the Silk Roads. And also from China, they could jump right into India without ever having to cross through the territory that's controlled by the Ottomans or by any of the Muslim states such as the Safavid located in Persia. The other really benefit to this is that it was easy to take over the Philippines. They were small and militarily weak societies because of the way that they were organized under various chieftains. That meant that it was another divide and conquer kind of situation, and they didn't have a lot to lose when they went in and conquered the Philippines. And then lastly, there weren't any competing claims here from other major countries in Western Europe at the time. Perhaps they hadn't found the Philippines, or perhaps they hadn't realized the value that the Philippines could have as a jumping off point or a launching point into the rest of Asia, and also down into Australia at one point as well. And don't forget that within Indonesia, there are the spice islands such as Java, which are going to be particularly helpful to the Spanish. When you look at the characteristics of Spanish rule compared to that of the Portuguese, they are very different. Where the Portuguese wanted to set up a trading post empire, the Spanish wanted to establish colonial rule, meaning that they wanted to make the Philippines their own colony, and in order to colonize, you need to settle down and intermingle with the people. They end up taking over the islands between about 1565 and 1665, and it stays in the hands of the Spanish as a colonial territory until we get to the end of the 1800s. It's right after the Spanish-American War in 1898 that the United States actually takes control of the Philippines next. Now, the other thing that you see are some missionary efforts that are ongoing when the Spanish settle in the Philippines. They create these religious orders that they force the people to go and join. And Filipino society is still one of the major outposts of Christianity in this part of the world. But if you go today, there's the southern island of Mindanao where Islam actually gained strength, and the area is still pretty hotly contested today. Some of the other things that you see happening under Spanish rule is that they come in and they forcibly relocate some of the people. They force them to pay tribute and also to pay taxes, and they force many of the men and women to perform unpaid labor for them. They set up these very large estates for the Spanish settlers and give them the best land, of course. And because of the fact that women in Filipino society were given these roles as ritual healers, the Spanish really attacked this role of women because it kind of undermined the authority of patriarchy. And then the center of all of this was Manila. It becomes a major center with a diverse population. It's still a large part of the Philippines where people go to visit, and it actually becomes a huge part of the trade network of silver in this time period between Acapulco and Manila. And you're going to see that one of the characteristics of Spanish rule is that there are going to be some periodic revolts by the Chinese people, actually, and the Spanish are going to either expel or massacre any of the people who revolt several times throughout the course of their rule. The Dutch and the English both entered the Indian Ocean commerce right around the early 17th century, and they quickly displaced the Portuguese and began to compete with one another. Right around 1600, both the Dutch and the English organized these private trading companies in order to handle their stake in the Indian Ocean trade routes. And the merchants would then invest in these trading companies and share the risks and also the rewards of their attempt at commerce in the Indian Ocean. And the Dutch and the British East India Companies were chartered by their respective governments, and they had the power to make war and to govern the conquered people. If you look at the areas that they targeted, the Dutch Empire was focused on Indonesia, and the British Empire was focused on India. The Dutch of the 16th century were very highly commercialized and urbanized, living in incredibly wealthy and nice cities. They had very strong business skills as well as maritime shipping skills. But if you compare their attempt at commerce and acquisition during the age of exploration with that of other countries, there was a great deal of bloodshed and the use of force. The Dutch went in and forced the people of Indonesia to sell products only to the Dutch, and they destroyed all of the crops and in many cases killed people who refused to help them. Probably the best example of the kind of force used by the Dutch was what happened in the Banda Islands. The Dutch went into the Banda Islands and they used the people who already lived there as slave labor. They required them to produce nutmeg and cloves and mace, and those who refused were killed, and everyone else was enslaved and forced to work on what were essentially plantations. They basically killed or starved to death an entire population of about 15,000 indigenous inhabitants, and then they went in and replaced them with Dutch planters and took over their entire society. The monopoly that they had in the 17th century was over nutmeg, cloves, and mace, and they would grow these products or have others grow them for them, and then they would go back into Europe and into India and sell them for anywhere from 14 to 17 times the price it took to actually produce them. In comparison to the Dutch, the British East India Company was not really as well financed or as commercially sophisticated, and they couldn't break into the Spice Islands in the same way that the Dutch did. So instead, they established three major trade settlements in India, and they did this in Bombay on the west coast, Calcutta on the east coast, and Madras on the east coast as well. And they realized pretty quickly that they couldn't compete with the Mughal Empire, that Muslim gunpowder empire that existed in India. So instead, they go in and they negotiate with the local rulers, and they're able to peacefully establish trade bases, which is far different than what happened with the Dutch. Now, the British begin by trading pepper and other spices, but they realize very quickly that more money is going to be made from cotton because cotton is very highly demanded back home. Alright, so now that we have looked at some of the causes of the Age of Exploration and the reason why Western Europeans were so successful with the Age of Exploration, and we've also looked at ways in which various Western European countries engaged in controlling commerce, I want to talk a little bit about what it was like when these places colonized new territory. We're going to divide this up into three different areas. First, we'll look at European empires coming into the Americas, and depending on which empire we're actually talking about, it's going to depend on how the people were treated. The next thing we'll look at is the Russian Empire in the steppes as well as in Siberia, and lastly, the Asian Empire, the spread of the Chinese, for example, into different territories. The last thing I'd like you guys to do is actually a little bit of reading from a PDF that's located on Moodle that discusses the ways in which countries colonize one another during the Age of Exploration, and it specifically focuses on three places. First, it looks at European empires in the Americas, and it discusses not just the settler colonies that we are most familiar with in North America, because these are what we study in our American history classes, but also the sugar colonies, for example, as well as the treatment of the Inca and the Aztec. It also looks at the Russian Empire and its expansion into the steppes and into Siberia under Catherine the Great. And lastly, it looks at the expansion of the Asian Empire, in particular of China, during the Age of Exploration. And I have a link that I'm going to put on Moodle for you. It's definitely not a mandatory thing that you need to watch, but there's a series called Guns, Germs, and Steel. It's based off of this award-winning book that was written by Professor Jared Diamond, and he goes through and he talks about why it is that Europeans were so easily able to colonize the New World. And he says that there are certain steps that are involved in colonization no matter who is doing the colonizing. And the first step is always you send out your explorers. And these are explorers that you've probably learned about dozens of times in elementary, middle school, and high school. They go out and they claim the land for their home country. They conquer any native people who inhabit that land, and they accidentally, or sometimes on purpose, spread disease amongst those natives to make conquest easier. They start to export the wealth of the new land, so for example, gold, silver, lumber, and furs, to their home country, and they essentially steal the natural resources from the natives. After this, the colonists go and set down more permanent roots, and the settlers end up stealing more land from the very few remaining indigenous people, and they engage in activities like farming and mining and lumber and the fur trade. They began importing slaves, usually from Africa, to provide cheap labor on their farms and their mines and in their plantation system. And then, lastly, they fight with other European nations when necessary in order to defend or expand their colonies and to maintain control of those areas. Now, what his book as well as these videos are really good at doing is explaining why it was so easy to come in and colonize these people. And there's often this mindset that there was this superiority of European culture that made it super easy to dominate the people, but there's a whole host of reasons that are interacting with one another that cause the near extermination of indigenous people. And so while it's very important to me that you go through and read about the different ways of colonizing, if you do have free time and you do find this conversation or this topic really interesting, then perhaps you'll want to watch one of the segments of Diamond's video series, Guns, Germs, and Steel.